Welcome back to the Duke's Revenge, where the coldest hearts burn the hottest and where the most overlooked souls sometimes hold the greatest power. I'm so glad you're here with me today for another tale of betrayal, obsession, and the kind of revenge that transforms into something far more dangerous than hate. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you listening from right now? Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I love seeing our community span across continents, from New York to Singapore, from London to Sydney. There's something magical about knowing we're all sharing this story together, no matter where we are. Tonight's story takes us to the glittering ballrooms and shadowed estates of 1842 London, where a young woman has been forced into the most humiliating marriage of the season. At 18, sold to the fattest duke in England, a man society mocked behind gilded fans and whispered about in drawing rooms. They pitied her. They laughed at her fate. But what no one knew, what not a single soul in that ballroom could have guessed, was why he chose her. And when the wedding night arrived, when the masks finally fell away, the truth would shatter everything she thought she knew about revenge, about sacrifice, and about the man who had been watching her far longer than anyone realized. They called him grotesque. They said she'd been sold like cattle to a monster. But when the Duke of Harrowgate locked the door to their wedding chamber and finally spoke the words he'd kept buried for 7 years, Rosalind understood that some revenges are written in the stars, long before the world even knows there's a debt to pay. Let me take you back to that March evening, where the air smelled of orange blossoms and betrayal, where champagne flowed like bitter tears, and where one girl's nightmare was about to reveal itself as something else entirely, something her heart wasn't prepared for, something that would consume them both. The rain had been falling for 3 days when Rosalind Ashford learned she was to be sold. She stood in the morning room of Ashford Manor, the pale yellow walls seeming to close in around her as her father's words echoed in the space between them. The teacup in her hand trembled, sending ripples across the surface of the Earl Grey that had gone cold an hour ago. When this conversation had begun with her mother's tear-stained face and her father's grim determination, "The Duke of Harrowgate has made an offer," Lord Ashford repeated, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had gambled away not just his fortune, but his daughter's future. "A generous offer. One that will save this family from complete ruin." Rosalind set the teacup down with careful precision, her hands steadier than her voice. "The Duke of Harrowgate. You mean Maximilian Harrowgate. The man they call—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't speak aloud the cruel nicknames that London society had bestowed upon the wealthiest, most reclusive duke in England. The Fat Duke. The Hermit of Harrowgate Hall. The Mountain. "I know what they call him," her father said sharply, turning away to stare out the rain-streaked windows at the sodden gardens beyond. "I also know that he owns half of Yorkshire, 3 estates in Scotland, and enough shipping concerns to rival the East India Company itself. His offer includes the immediate settlement of our debts, all of them, plus a dowry settlement that will restore the Ashford name to respectability." "You're selling me to a recluse," Rosalind said, her voice hollow. "A man who hasn't attended a London season in over a decade. A man who—" She stopped again, propriety warring with the horror rising in her throat. Her mother rose from the settee, her silk skirts rustling like dead leaves. "Rosalind, you must understand. Your father had no choice. The creditors were going to seize Ashford Manor. We would have been cast out, left with nothing. No prospects, no future. No daughter worth marrying off," Rosalind finished bitterly. At 18, she was neither a great beauty nor a brilliant wit. Her hair was an ordinary brown, her eyes a plain hazel, her figure unremarkable. She had spent 3 seasons in London as a wallflower, watching her more beautiful, more vivacious peers spin through ballrooms like butterflies, while she sat with the chaperones and the elderly aunts. Invisible, forgettable. She had made peace with that invisibility, had even found a kind of comfort in it. But this was not peace. This was sacrifice on an altar she hadn't known existed. "When?" she asked quietly. 3 weeks, her father said. The Duke wishes the ceremony to take place at Harrowgate Hall. A private affair. Of course he did, Rosalind thought. He wouldn't want London society watching, wouldn't want the spectacle of the season's most pitied girl being shackled to England's most mocked peer. Even in marriage, they would be invisible together. The weeks passed in a blur of fittings and preparations that felt more like funeral rites than wedding festivities. Rosalind's trousseau was assembled with mechanical efficiency, fine silks and delicate laces that would be packed away in trunks and sent north to Yorkshire, to a life she couldn't begin to imagine. Her friends, the few she had, offered careful condolences disguised as congratulations. Her cousins whispered behind their fans at the engagement tea, their pity as suffocating as their perfume. Through it all, the Duke himself remained absent. He sent communications through his solicitor formal, precise documents, outlining settlements and arrangements, with all the warmth of a business contract. Which, Rosalind supposed, was exactly what this marriage was. There was no courtship, no stolen moments in moonlit gardens, no poetry or protestations of affection. Just papers to sign and trunks to pack, and a future as blank and terrifying as fresh snow. The night before her departure for Yorkshire, Rosalind's younger sister Margaret crept into her room and curled up beside her on the bed as she had done when they were children. "Are you frightened?" Margaret whispered, her 14-year-old face solemn in the candlelight. Rosalind considered lying, but found she didn't have the strength. "Terrified. They say he never leaves Harrowgate Hall," Margaret continued, clearly having overheard more servants' gossip than was proper. "That he's built his own kingdom there and rules it like some medieval baron. That he's so large he needs special furniture made. That he—" "Margaret, please!" Rosalind interrupted gently. "I've heard all the rumors. Every single one." Her sister was quiet for a moment, then asked in a smaller voice, "Do you think he'll be cruel?" It was the question Rosalind had been asking herself for 3 weeks, the fear that woke her in the dark hours before dawn. She had heard the other stories, too, whispers of the Duke's temper, of servants who left his employ with haunted expressions, of the previous Duchess who had died under mysterious circumstances that no one would discuss in polite company. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "But I suppose I'll find out soon enough." The journey to Harrowgate Hall took 2 days by carriage, 2 days of rain-slicked roads and gray skies that matched the gray weight in Rosalind's chest. Her mother had accompanied her, maintaining a brittle cheerfulness that cracked more with each passing mile, while her father had remained in London to attend to business, which Rosalind translated as avoiding the sight of his daughter's sacrifice. They arrived at dusk on a Thursday, the carriage winding up a long drive bordered by ancient oaks whose bare branches clawed at the violet sky. And then Harrowgate Hall rose before them like something from a Gothic novel, all dark stone and towering turrets, windows glowing with warm light that should have been welcoming but instead felt like eyes watching their approach. "Oh my," her mother breathed, and Rosalind couldn't tell if it was awe or horror in her voice. The carriage stopped before massive oak doors that opened even as the footman was lowering the steps. A tall, severe woman in black silk emerged, her iron-gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her already sharp features. "Lady Rosalind, Lady Ashford," the woman said, her voice as crisp as November frost. "I am Mrs. Blackwood, the housekeeper. His Grace extends his welcome and asks that you refresh yourselves from your journey. He will join you for dinner at 8 o'clock. Rosalind descended from the carriage, her traveling dress damp from the mist that hung over the Yorkshire moors like a shroud. As she stepped into the entrance hall, she had to stop herself from gasping. The space was enormous, 2 stories high, with a grand staircase that swept upward in a graceful curve. But it was the warmth that struck her most. The entire hall was lit with what must have been 100 candles, and fires blazed in twin fireplaces large enough to roast oxen. After the chill of the journey, it felt like stepping into an embrace. "Your chambers are prepared in the east wing, Mrs." Blackwood continued, leading them up the stairs with brisk efficiency. "Hot water is already drawn for your baths. I trust you'll find everything to your satisfaction." Rosalind's rooms were more beautiful than anything she'd expected. A sitting room decorated in shades of ivory and gold, a bedroom with a four-poster bed draped in silk, the color of morning light, and a dressing room where her trunks were already being unpacked by two young maids who curtsied nervously when she entered. "The amber silk for dinner, my lady?" one of them asked, holding up a gown that Rosalind's London modist had insisted would bring out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes. "Yes, thank you," Rosalind murmured, too drained to make decisions about something as trivial as which gown to wear when meeting the man who had purchased her future. An hour later, bathed and dressed and with her hair arranged in an elegant chignon that her new lady's maid had executed with surprising skill, Rosalind made her way back downstairs. Her mother had pleaded fatigue and requested a tray in her room, a transparent excuse that Rosalind both resented and understood. This was, after all, her fate to face alone. Mrs. Blackwood met her at the bottom of the stairs and led her through a series of corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced Harrowgates who had lorded over this hall for generations. Finally, they reached a set of double doors, from which the low murmur of male voices emerged. "The small dining room," Mrs. Blackwood announced, pushing open the doors. The room beyond was anything but small. Perhaps it was small by Harrowgate Hall standards, but it could easily have accommodated 20 guests around the gleaming mahogany table. Tonight, though, only 2 places were set. At one end of the table, facing each other across a distance that felt both intimate and vast. And standing by the fireplace, a glass of wine in one massive hand, was the Duke of Harrowgate. Rosalind had prepared herself for this moment, had steeled herself for whatever she might find. But nothing, no rumors, no whispered warnings, no dire imaginings, had prepared her for the reality of Maximilian Harrowgate. He was, indeed, an enormous man, tall, well over 6 feet, and broad in a way that suggested not softness, but solid, immovable mass. His shoulders strained against the fine tailoring of his evening coat, and his legs, encased in perfectly fitted breeches, were like tree trunks. His neck was thick, his hands huge, his belly pronounced beneath his waistcoat. Everything about him was outsized, overwhelming, larger than life itself, but it was his face that stopped Rosalind's breath in her throat. Because Maximilian Harrowgate was not grotesque, he was not repulsive. His face was broad, yes, with heavy features and a jaw like carved granite. His eyes were small in that expansive face, but they were the most extraordinary shade of amber brown, lit from within like whiskey held up to sunlight. His hair was dark and thick, touched with premature silver at the temples. And his mouth was beautiful. Full lips that seemed incongruous with the rest of him, mobile and expressive, in a face that otherwise seemed designed for immobility. "Lady Rosalind," he said, and his voice was like thunder rolling across distant hills, deep and rumbling, and somehow sad. "I apologize for not meeting your carriage. I thought it might be easier for you if we met this way first. More controlled." He set down his wineglass and made a small, stiff bow that seemed to cost him effort, as though even that simple movement was difficult with his bulk. Rosalind curtsied, remembering her training even as her mind spun. "Your Grace, I thank you for your hospitality. Please, sit." He gestured to the table. "Dinner will be served shortly, but I thought perhaps we should speak first. There are things you deserve to know before tomorrow's ceremony." Tomorrow. The wedding was tomorrow. Rosalind had known this, of course, but hearing him say it made her heart lurch against her ribs like a caged bird. She took her seat, hyper-aware of the way he moved around the table to his own chair, carefully, deliberately, as though he had learned long ago to be conscious of his size in spaces built for smaller men. He didn't sit so much as lower himself into the reinforced chair with controlled precision. "I imagine," he began, his amber eyes fixed on the tablecloth rather than her face, "that you've heard many things about me, most of them unflattering." "I've heard rumors," Rosalind admitted carefully, "but I was taught that rumors are often more fiction than fact." His mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. diplomatic. Your father chose well. The bitterness in those last words was unmistakable. My father, Rosalind said quietly, chose what he could afford, which was you, your grace, and your willingness to pay his debts. The amber eyes finally lifted to meet hers, and Rosalind saw surprise there. You're honest, at least. That's unexpected. I see little point in pretense. Rosalind replied, You've purchased a bride as one might purchase a horse. I'm sure you have expectations for what you've acquired. It would be efficient to discuss them now. Something that might have been respect flickered across his broad features. Very well, then let me be equally honest. I don't expect love from you, Lady Rosalind. I don't even expect affection. What I require is a duchess who can manage this household, represent my interests in society when necessary, and produce an heir. In exchange, you'll have freedom, security, and every comfort I can provide. We need not spend more time together than duty requires. Each word landed like a stone in still water, and Rosalind forced herself to nod, as though they were discussing the menu for next week's dinners, rather than the architecture of her entire future. And if I fail to produce an heir, she asked, keeping her voice level. Then we fail together, he said simply. I won't cast you aside or seek elsewhere. I'm many things, Lady Rosalind, but I'm not an adulterer. They say you never attend London society anymore, Rosalind continued, accepting the glass of wine a silent footman poured for her. That you've made yourself a hermit here. They say correctly, Maximilian replied. I attended precisely 3 seasons in London, from the ages of 22 to 24. I believe you would have been a child then. I found the experience intolerable. The stares, the whispers, the ladies who fainted when I approached them, the men who made jokes just loud enough for me to hear. So I came home to Yorkshire and decided society could go hang itself. There was no self-pity in his voice, just flat, matter-of-fact recitation. But Rosalind heard the wound beneath it, old and scarred, but still tender. And yet you need a wife, she observed. An heir. I have responsibilities, he said. Duty doesn't care whether one is popular in ballrooms. The Harrowgate line must continue. And I won't inflict this. He gestured at himself with one massive hand. On a son born outside wedlock. So yes, I need a wife. And your father needed money. Our needs aligned. Dinner arrived then, course after course of beautifully prepared food that Rosalind barely tasted. They ate mostly in silence, the only sounds the clink of silverware against china and the crackle of the fire. She snuck glances at him between courses, noting the way he ate, with surprising delicacy despite his size. The careful way he maneuvered the fine crystal and china as though afraid he might shatter them with an incautious movement. When the final course had been cleared away, Maximilian pushed back from the table with visible effort. You should retire, he said abruptly. Tomorrow will be draining. The ceremony is scheduled for 11 o'clock in the chapel. Mrs. Blackwood has arranged everything. You need only appear. And you? Rosalind heard herself ask. What will you do tonight? He looked at her fully then, those amber eyes searching her face as though trying to solve a puzzle. I'll drink too much port in my study and wonder what kind of man sells his daughter to a monster to clear his debts. Before Rosalind could respond, he had moved past her toward the door with that same careful deliberation, leaving her alone in the dining room with nothing but the dying fire and the weight of words that hadn't been spoken. She returned to her chambers to find her wedding gown laid out across the bed, a confection of ivory silk and Brussels lace that must have cost more than her family's quarterly income. Clearly, the Duke spared no expense when it came to appearances. Even for a wedding no one would attend. Sleep was impossible. Rosalind lay in the beautiful bed in the beautiful room and stared at the canopy above her head while her mind churned. She thought about her father's face when he'd told her about the arrangement, her mother's tears, Margaret's frightened questions, and most of all, she thought about those amber eyes and the bitter resignation in the Duke's voice when he'd called himself a monster. The chapel bells woke her at dawn deep, sonorous tones that rolled across the Yorkshire moors like the voice of God. Rosalind rose and went to the window, pulling back the heavy curtains to see Harrowgate Hall spread out below her in the gray morning light. Gardens, now bare for winter, stretched toward wooded parkland. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys. In the distance, she could see tenant cottages and the peaked roofs of what must be the village of Harrowgate itself. It was beautiful. Austere and imposing, yes, but beautiful in the way that wild, uncompromising things are beautiful. And it was to be hers now. This place, this life, this enormous man who ate dinner like he was afraid of breaking the china. Her mother appeared at breakfast, red-eyed and anxious. Are you well, dearest?" "As well as can be expected," Rosalind replied, spreading marmalade on toast she wouldn't eat. "The Duke was civil last night." "Civil," her mother repeated hollowly. "Oh, Rosalind, I'm so sorry. If there had been any other way—" "There wasn't," Rosalind interrupted gently, but firmly. "And we both know it. So let's not pretend otherwise. Let's just get through today." The ceremony was scheduled for 11, and at 10:30, Rosalind's lady's maid helped her into the ivory silk gown with shaking hands. The fabric whispered against her skin like secrets, and the lace veil her mother arranged over her hair was so fine it seemed made of morning mist. "You're a beautiful bride," her mother said, but her voice broke on the last word. Rosalind studied her reflection in the full-length mirror. The gown transformed her, made her look like something precious and delicate and worthy of protection. It was a lie, of course. She wasn't precious. She was a debt payment. But perhaps for one day, she could pretend otherwise. Mrs. Blackwood knocked precisely at 11 and led them through the halls to the chapel. It was a small, ancient stone building attached to the main house. Its stained glass windows, casting pools of colored light across the flagstone floor. There were no guests, no witnesses beyond the vicar and Mrs. Blackwood herself, and a handful of servants who had been summoned to fill out the legally required attendance. And standing at the altar, dressed in severe black tailcoat that somehow made him look even more massive, was Maximilian Harrowgate. Rosalind's mother squeezed her hand once, then took her seat in the front pew as Rosalind made the long walk down the aisle alone. She kept her eyes fixed on the cross above the altar, couldn't bear to look at the Duke's face, couldn't bear to see what expression he wore as his purchased bride approached. But when she reached him and finally looked up, she found him watching her with something that looked almost like wonder. It was gone in an instant, replaced by his usual stoic mask. But for one heartbeat, she had seen it genuine awe, as though she were something miraculous appearing before him. The ceremony was brief and impersonal. The vicar rushed through the ancient words as though eager to be done with this transaction masquerading as a sacrament. Rosalind repeated her vows, in a voice that sounded nothing like her own. Maximilian's vows were delivered in that deep rumble, his amber eyes never leaving her face. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Maximilian leaned down, way down, and pressed the briefest, coldest kiss to her cheek, before straightening immediately, as though even that small contact had been an intrusion. And then it was done. She was the Duchess of Harrowgate. She was his. The wedding breakfast was another awkward affair, with her mother making desperate attempts at conversation that died in the face of Maximilian's monosyllabic responses. By the time the meal ended, Lady Ashford was dabbing at her eyes with her handkerchief and speaking of catching the afternoon coach back to London. "So soon?" Rosalind asked, panic fluttering in her chest despite her best efforts to remain calm. "Your father needs me," her mother said, which they both knew was a polite lie. "And you have a new life to begin here. I'll only be in the way. You indecessed of you two batter, with or no in the pot off. I'll only be in the way. You indecessed of you two batter, and he would she one at the side. You indecessed of you two batter, which you have a new life to begin here. You indecessed of..." The farewell at the carriage was brief and painful. Her mother clung to her, whispering apologies and endearments. before finally releasing her and climbing into the coach with the help of a footman. Rosalind stood on the front steps of Harrowgate Hall and watched the carriage disappear down the tree-lined drive, taking with it the last connection to her former life. When she finally turned back to the house, she found Maximilian standing in the entrance hall, watching her with an unreadable expression. "Mrs. Blackwood will show you the rest of the house," he said. "Familiarize yourself with your domain, Your Grace." Your Grace. She was Your Grace now, Duchess of Harrowgate. The title sat on her shoulders like an ill-fitting cloak. The tour of Harrowgate Hall took 2 hours, and with each room, Rosalind's understanding of her husband's wealth grew. The library alone could have swallowed Ashford Manor's entire ground floor, thousands of books lining mahogany shelves that reached toward a painted ceiling depicting classical scenes. The music room held not 1 but 3 pianofortes, plus a harp and a collection of string instruments in glass cases. The portrait gallery was lined with Harrowgates, going back 7 generations, their painted eyes following her progress with aristocratic disdain. "His Grace's private apartments are in the West Wing, Mrs." Blackwood said crisply when they reached a particular corridor. "You need not concern yourself with that area. Your own chambers are quite separate, and His Grace values his privacy." The unspoken message was clear. The Duke didn't want her wandering into his personal space. They were to live parallel lives in this enormous house, crossing paths only when duty required. That evening, Rosalind dined alone in the small dining room where she and Maximilian had eaten the night before. Mrs. Blackwood informed her that His Grace was dining in his study and would be occupied with business matters for the foreseeable future. Rosalind ate mechanical bites of excellent food and wondered if this was to be her life. Now, solitary meals in beautiful rooms, a ghost in her own house. She retired early, exhausted by the emotional toll of the day. Her new lady's maid, a quiet girl named Sarah, helped her out of her wedding gown and into a nightdress of finest lawn before departing with a curtsy, leaving Rosalind alone in her chambers. She was sitting at her dressing table, brushing out her hair with slow, methodical strokes, when she heard the knock at her door. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Blackwood with some household matter. But it was Maximilian who entered, still dressed in his evening clothes, his massive frame filling the doorway. Rosalind's hand froze mid-stroke, the brush suspended in the air as her heart began to pound. "Your Grace," she managed. "I wasn't expecting." "I know," he said quietly. "This isn't. I don't mean to disturb your rest, but there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you before the ceremony, but He trailed off, his jaw working as though the words were physically difficult to produce. Rosalind set down her brush and turned to face him fully, drawing her wrapper closed over her nightdress with suddenly nervous fingers. "What is it?" He stood there for a long moment, clearly struggling with himself. Then, in a voice so low she had to strain to hear it, he said, "I didn't choose you randomly, Rosalind. I didn't simply pick your father's name from a list of debtors and decide you would do as well as any other." Her breath caught. "What do you mean?" Maximilian moved further into the room, but stopped a careful distance from where she sat, maintaining that space he always seemed to keep between himself and the world. His amber eyes were dark, with something she couldn't name. "7 years ago," he began, "during my last season in London, I attended a ball at Devonshire House. I was 24, still naive enough to think that perhaps, despite my size, despite what people said about me, I might find something, someone. I stood against a wall, as I always did, watching the dancing and wishing I could disappear into the floor. And then I saw you." Rosalind's mind spun backward, trying to grasp what he was saying. 7 years ago, I was 11 years old." "You were," he agreed, a ghost of a smile touching his mouth. "Far too young to be attending balls, obviously. You were with your governess. I remember her severe gray dress. Your mother must have brought you along and left you in the upper gallery to watch the dancing. Most children would have been bored. But you," his voice softened in a way she'd never heard before, "you were transfixed. You stood at the railing with your hands curled around the bars like a prisoner watching freedom. And your face, God, Rosalind, your face was so full of longing and wonder, like you were watching magic happen below you. She did remember. Remembered begging her mother to let her come, promising to be invisible and quiet. Remembered the thrill of seeing that glittering world spread out below her, all those beautiful people in their beautiful clothes, moving through the dance like figures in a fairy tale. "I watched you for an hour," Maximilian continued, his voice rough. "I should have been mingling. Should have been doing what I'd come to London to do. But I couldn't look away from this child who stared at a ballroom full of aristocrats like they were everything magical and good in the world, and I thought..." He stopped, swallowed hard. I thought, she still believes in beauty. She hasn't learned yet what the world really is, what people really are. Rosalind stood slowly, her legs uncertain beneath her. "You remembered me? An 11-year-old child in a gallery? For 7 years? I couldn't forget," he said simply. "I spent 3 more weeks in London that season, enduring all the usual cruelties. And every time it became too much, I would remember your face in that gallery, your innocence, your wonder. It became a sort of talisman for me, proof that not everyone in the world was cruel and shallow, that somewhere there was still someone who could look at a ballroom full of pompous aristocrats and see magic." He moved closer now, and Rosalind could smell his scent, sandalwood and smoke, and something darker, something that made her pulse quicken despite her confusion. "I went back to Yorkshire and buried myself in managing my estates," he continued. "I told myself I was content with my life, that I didn't need what I couldn't have. And then, 6 months ago, I was in London on business. I attended a dinner at your uncle's house, strictly business, a matter of some shipping contracts, and you were there." "I don't remember," Rosalind whispered. "No reason you should. You barely looked at me. You were helping your aunt with the seating arrangements, moving between rooms with this quiet efficiency. You'd grown into a young woman not beautiful by society's standards, perhaps, but there was something about you, the same quality I'd seen in that child 7 years ago. Gentleness. Kindness in the way you spoke to the servants, in how you arranged the table so the most difficult guest would be seated beside someone patient. You still saw people, really saw them, in a way most of society never does." Rosalind's mind was reeling. "So you, what? Decided to marry me based on seeing me at a dinner party?" "I decided to find out who you were," he corrected. "I made inquiries, discreet ones, learned about your family's financial troubles, about your father's gambling debts, about the fact that you'd had 3 seasons in London and received no serious offers." His jaw tightened. "I learned that society had dismissed you as thoroughly as they'd dismissed me. Just for different reasons. You weren't pretty enough, witty enough, wealthy enough. You were overlooked, invisible. And you thought we'd make a perfect pair," Rosalind said, not quite able to keep the bitterness from her voice. "2 outcasts, equally desperate." "No," he said sharply, then softer. "No. I thought..." He broke off, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I thought perhaps I could offer you something better than what you'd have otherwise. Not love, I know myself too well to promise that. Know that no woman could love this." He gestured at his enormous body with disgust. "But safety, security, freedom from being sold to some worse alternative because your father's debts demanded it." "And what do you get?" Rosalind asked, her voice steadier now despite the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "Besides the obvious requirements of a duchess?" He was close enough now that she had to tilt her head back to look at him, close enough that she could see the complex emotions warring in those amber eyes. "I get," he said slowly, carefully, "to spend the rest of my life with the only person who ever made me believe the world might contain something good. I get to know that the girl in the gallery, the one who thought ballrooms were magical, has a safe place to exist. Even if she learns to hate me for trapping her here, even if she looks at me with the same disgust everyone else does, at least she'll be safe. She'll be protected. She'll have everything I can possibly give her. Rosalind stared at him. This enormous man, with his tragic amber eyes and his 7-year-old memory of a child in a gallery. "You've been planning this," she said slowly. "For months, waiting for the right moment to approach my father." "I won't lie to you," Maximilian said. "When I learned the extent of his debts, I saw an opportunity. I made him an offer he couldn't refuse, at precisely the moment when he had no other options. I backed him into a corner. I'm not proud of the manipulation, but I won't apologize for it either. I wanted you here. I wanted you safe, and I was willing to use whatever means necessary to make that happen." That's... Rosalind's voice failed her. She didn't know what it was. Monstrous? Romantic? Obsessive? All of those things at once? "I know what you're thinking," Maximilian said, taking a step back, that careful distance reasserting itself. "You're thinking, I'm mad. That this is some twisted obsession with a child I saw once 7 years ago. And perhaps you're right. Perhaps I am mad. But I meant what I said at dinner last night. I expect nothing from you beyond your duties as Duchess. You need never know how I feel. You need never... How do you feel?" The question escaped before Rosalind could stop it. He looked at her for a long moment, vulnerability and anguish naked on his broad face, like a man who sold his soul for one glimpse of heaven, like someone who knows he can never deserve what he wants, but took it anyway, like the monster everyone already thinks I am. And then he was moving toward the door, that ponderous, careful movement that tried so hard not to disturb the world around him. "Wait," Rosalind heard herself say. "Please." He stopped, his massive hand on the door handle, but didn't turn around. "You're not a monster," she said quietly. "Monsters don't spend 7 years remembering a child's wonder. Monsters don't save desperate families, even while condemning themselves for the method. Monsters don't. Don't speak the way you just spoke to me." His shoulders tensed. "You don't know what I am." "Then show me," Rosalind said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "You've brought me here. You've married me. You've told me this impossible, extraordinary thing. Don't walk away now. Don't leave me alone in this beautiful prison, wondering what happens next." Slowly, so slowly, he turned to face her. "What do you want from me, Rosalind?" She wasn't sure how to answer that. Wasn't sure what she wanted beyond the certainty that she didn't want to spend her wedding night alone. Didn't want to begin this strange marriage with him retreating to his separate chambers and her retreating to hers, with 7 years of secret longing hanging between them like a ghost. "I want," she said carefully, "to understand. You've watched me for 7 years, apparently. Built some sort of image of me in your mind. But I know nothing about you, beyond rumors and one dinner conversation. That hardly seems fair." Something that might have been hope flickered in his eyes. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," Rosalind said simply. "Start with why you truly left London after those 3 seasons. You said you found it intolerable, but there's more to it than that, isn't there?" For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer, would retreat behind his walls of stoic reserve. But then he moved back into the room, not approaching her, but taking up a position by the fireplace, one massive hand braced against the mantel. "The 3rd season," he began, his voice distant. "I made the mistake of believing I might actually succeed in finding a wife. There was a young lady, Lady Victoria something or other. I've tried to forget her name. She was kind to me, or seemed to be. We danced twice at the Hartworth ball. She didn't faint or make excuses to escape my company. I actually allowed myself to hope." He paused, staring into the flames. 3 days later, I overheard her in a garden during another event. She was with her friends, all of them laughing, and one of them asked if it was true about the Duke of Harrowgate, whether she was actually considering his suit. His jaw clenched. She said, and I remember every word, Rosalind, every single word she said, "God, no. I'd rather die a spinster than let that mountain of flesh touch me. I was simply being polite. Someone has to be. And the entertainment value of watching him try to navigate a ballroom is worth the occasional dance. Rosalind's hand went to her mouth, horror flooding through her. That was the moment, Maximilian continued flatly, that I understood exactly what I was to society. Entertainment, a curiosity, something to be tolerated and mocked, but never, ever taken seriously as a man who might deserve love or companionship. And I told myself I didn't need what they wouldn't give me. Until you saw a child in a gallery, Rosalind said softly. Until I saw you, he corrected, finally looking at her. And I know how that sounds. I know it makes me seem like some sort of predator, targeting a child. But I swear to you, it wasn't like that. You were just a moment of grace in a nightmare evening. A reminder that somewhere, innocence still existed. I never imagined I'd actually meet you again, let alone marry you. When I saw you at that dinner, it felt like fate or destiny or some other force intervening. So you invented reasons to attend more London social functions, Rosalind guessed, hoping to see me again. He nodded slowly. I went to 3 more dinners that season. Each time, I made sure your father knew about my interest in his business ventures. Made sure I was invited to the same events as your family. I watched you, Rosalind. I watched you be ignored and overlooked and dismissed. And it made me furious. Made me want to gather you up and bring you here, where no one could hurt you. That's, Rosalind searched for the right word. Intense, a bitter laugh escaped him. That's one word for it. Obsessive is probably more accurate. But I'd given up on finding any woman who could tolerate me, let alone care for me. You were never supposed to be anything more than a pleasant memory. The universe just kept pushing us together until I finally gave in and acted. By manipulating my father into selling me to you, Rosalind said. Yes, he agreed, without flinching. I won't dress it up as something noble. I saw what I wanted, and I took it, using your family's desperation as leverage. That makes me exactly the monster you called me earlier. I didn't call you that, Rosalind corrected. I said you weren't a monster. There's a difference. He studied her with those penetrating amber eyes. Why aren't you angry? Why aren't you screaming at me or demanding to be sent back to your family? Any rational woman would be horrified by what I've just told you. Rosalind moved closer to him, not quite touching, but near enough that she had to crane her neck to look up into his face. Perhaps I'm not rational, or perhaps, she hesitated, then pushed forward. Perhaps I spent those 3 London seasons being invisible to every man in every ballroom, except the ones who looked at me like I was a commodity to be assessed and dismissed. And perhaps having someone, anyone, see me as something worth watching, worth waiting for, worth planning for, even if it's strange and intense and more than a little frightening, perhaps that's not the worst thing that could happen to an overlooked girl. His breath caught audibly. Rosalind, I'm not saying I love you, she interrupted quickly. I don't know you well enough for that. And I'm not saying I'm not frightened or confused or completely overwhelmed by everything you've just told me, but I'm also not saying I want you to leave. Not yet. The hope that dawned in his eyes was painful to witness, like watching someone who'd been starving suddenly shown food and not quite believing it was real. What are you saying then? He asked carefully. I'm saying, Rosalind replied, reaching up with a hand that shook only slightly to touch his broad chest, feeling his heart thunder beneath her palm, that you've spent 7 years building an image of me. Perhaps it's time you met the real person, and perhaps, she managed a small smile, it's time I met the real you, instead of the monster society thinks you are. Maximilian's massive hand came up slowly to cover hers, where it rested against his chest. His touch was gentle, reverent even, as though he were handling something infinitely precious and infinitely breakable. I won't force myself on you, he said quietly. Tonight or any night. Whatever else I am, I'm not that. We're married, yes, but you can have all the time you need before I. Before we consummate the marriage, Rosalind finished for him, feeling heat rise in her cheeks but refusing to look away. I appreciate that. But Maximilian, she used his name deliberately, wanting to establish that intimacy. I also don't want to spend our wedding night in separate chambers, wondering what you're thinking in the West Wing, while I'm isolated here in the East. That seems like a terrible way to begin. His eyes widened. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting, she said, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he must feel it through her palm. That you stay. Not for that, but stay. Talk to me. Help me understand this strange marriage we've entered into. Help me understand you. For a long moment he simply stared at her, and Rosalind saw the internal war playing out across his expressive features. Desire warring with honor, longing warring with fear of frightening her, hope warring with the certainty, built from years of rejection, that she must secretly be revolted by him. Are you sure? He finally asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. No, Rosalind admitted honestly. I'm not sure of anything anymore. But I'd rather be uncertain together than uncertain alone. That decided it. She saw the moment he gave in, the way his shoulders relaxed just slightly, the way his grip on her hand tightened, almost imperceptibly. Very well, he said. I'll stay, for as long as you'll have me. And so began the strangest, most unexpected wedding night in perhaps all of aristocratic England. Maximilian moved to one of the chairs by the fireplace, and Rosalind settled into the other, and they talked. They talked as the fire burned down to embers and the candles guttered in their holders. They talked as the Yorkshire night pressed against the windows and the rest of Harrowgate Hall fell silent around them. He told her about his childhood, about growing up already larger than other boys his age, about the teasing that had started in the nursery and never really stopped. He told her about his father, a cold, ashamed man who looked at his oversized son as though he were a personal failure of breeding. About his mother, who had died when he was 12, leaving him alone with a father who barely spoke to him except to critique. He died when I was 20, Maximilian said, staring into the dying fire. Apoplexy, the doctor said. I inherited everything. The title, the estates, the crushing expectations. And the first thing I did was come to London and try to prove I could be normal. That despite my size, I could find what my father had found. A suitable duchess, children, a normal life. And then Lady Victoria taught you otherwise, Rosalind said softly. She wasn't the only one, just the final one, the one that made me realize I'd been deluding myself. He looked at her then. Until you appeared at that dinner, looking exactly like I remembered and yet completely different. No longer a child, but a woman. And I thought, here is someone who might understand what it's like to be invisible for all the wrong reasons. Rosalind told him about her own childhood, about being the eldest daughter of an earl who gambled away fortunes, about watching her family's respectability crumble year by year, about her 3 seasons in London, sitting with the chaperones while girls younger and prettier than her were swept into dance after dance. I became very good at being invisible, she admitted, at making myself useful so people would at least acknowledge my presence. I knew I wasn't beautiful or charming enough to win a husband on my own merits, so I thought perhaps I could be indispensable instead. The one who always remembered names and titles, who could navigate seating arrangements, who could smooth over awkward social moments. I thought maybe someone would notice that quality and think it valuable enough to marry. But they didn't, Maximilian said. No, they just took advantage of my helpfulness and then forgot I existed the moment I stopped being useful. She smiled ruefully. So perhaps we are more alike than you thought. Both of us trying to prove we're worth more than society decided we were. Both of us failing. You didn't fail, he said fiercely. They failed you. They failed to see what was right in front of them. The conviction in his voice made something warm unfurl in Rosalind's chest, something dangerous and tender that she wasn't ready to examine too closely. As dawn began to gray the windows, they finally fell silent, exhausted but strangely peaceful. Maximilian had moved to sit on the floor beside her chair. I'll damage the furniture less, he'd said with dark humor, and Rosalind had let her hand rest on his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him beneath her fingers. "I should go," he said quietly as the first birds began their morning songs. "Let you rest. You must be exhausted." "I am," Rosalind admitted. "But Maximilian? Yes? Thank you. For telling me. For explaining. For seeing me. Even when I was just a child, in a gallery." He turned his head to look up at her, and in the pale dawn light, his face was young and unguarded, and almost beautiful in its vulnerability. "Thank you," he replied, "for not hating me when you had every right to." He left then, pulling himself to his feet with an effort that reminded Rosalind of just how difficult his size made everything, how much energy he had to expend on tasks that smaller men accomplished without thought. When the door closed behind him, Rosalind sat in the gray light and tried to make sense of everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. She'd been married. She'd learned her husband had been obsessed with her for 7 years. She'd discovered that beneath society's mocked fat duke was a man of surprising depth and wounded dignity. She had no idea what their marriage would become, couldn't guess whether the strange intimacy of this night would grow into something real or whether morning would bring back the awkwardness and distance. But as she finally climbed into bed and let sleep claim her, she thought about Maximilian's amber eyes and his reverent touch on her hand, and she thought that perhaps, just perhaps, being married to a monster might not be the tragedy everyone assumed it would be. After all, monsters were often just misunderstood creatures who'd learned too well that the world had no place for them, and Rosalind understood that lesson better than most. The days following their wedding night fell into an unexpected rhythm. Maximilian didn't retreat to his West Wing chambers and abandon her to solitude as she'd feared. Instead, he began joining her for meals, first dinner, then breakfast as well, then finally afternoon tea in the library. Their conversations grew easier, less guarded, though he still maintained that careful physical distance, as though afraid that coming too close might break whatever fragile understanding they'd built. He showed her the estate, taking her on long walks through the winter bare gardens and into the wooded parkland beyond. He introduced her to his steward, his tenant farmers, the villagers who depended on Harrowgate for their livelihoods. She watched him with these people, saw how they respected him, even loved him, in ways London society never had. He was fair in his dealings, generous with his wealth, attentive to their needs. The Duke of Harrowgate might be a hermit and a recluse to the wider world, but here in Yorkshire, he was simply their lord, and they were his people. And slowly, carefully, Rosalind began to understand the man she'd married. Not the monster of rumor, not the obsessive purchaser of desperate brides, but a complex, intelligent man who'd learned to protect himself by withdrawing from a world that had never wanted him. She began to see, too, the ways he'd built his life around his size. The reinforced furniture throughout the house, the doorways that had been widened just slightly, the custom-made clothing, the specially constructed carriages. Every aspect of his existence had been carefully arranged to accommodate a body that didn't fit the spaces designed for normal men. "It must be exhausting," she said one afternoon as they sat in the library, she with a book and he with estate ledgers spread across his oversized desk. He looked up, confused. "What must be?" "Always being conscious of your size, always having to measure whether you'll fit, whether you'll break something, whether you're taking up too much space." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, that she'd noticed. "You get used to it," he said quietly. "After a while, it becomes automatic, like breathing." "But you shouldn't have to," Rosalind insisted. "This is your home. You should be able to exist in it without constantly calculating and measuring and—" "Rosalind," he cut her off gently. "That's kind of you. But this is reality. I am what I am. No amount of wishing will change that." She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that he deserved better than a life of constant self-consciousness. But she also sensed that pushing too hard would only make him retreat behind his walls again. So she let it drop, filing the observation away with all the other small insights she was gathering about her husband. The question of consummating their marriage hung between them like smoke, invisible but present. Maximilian never raised it, never hinted or pressed. He'd meant what he said about giving her time. But Rosalind found herself increasingly aware of him in ways that had nothing to do with fear. The way his amber eyes tracked her movements when he thought she wasn't looking. The careful way he'd help her with her cloak, his massive hands gentle against her shoulders. The rich timbre of his voice when he read aloud to her in the evenings. A habit they'd fallen into almost by accident. She realized with some surprise, becoming attracted to him. Not despite his size, but somehow because of it, because of the way he'd learned to be gentle in a world that expected him to be monstrous, because of the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide behind his stoic reserve. 3 weeks into their marriage, as they sat in the library after dinner, Maximilian reading and she ostensibly doing embroidery, but mostly watching him over her needle, she finally spoke. "You said, on our wedding night, that you expect nothing from me beyond my duties as Duchess." His head jerked up, eyes suddenly wary. "I did, and I meant it. What if?" She set down her embroidery with hands that shook only slightly. "What if I'm ready for those duties to include more?" The book slipped from his hands, landing on the carpet with a soft thud that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Rosalind," he said carefully, "you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she interrupted. "But we're married, Maximilian. At some point, we need to be married in all ways. And She took a breath, forced herself to meet his eyes. "I think I'm ready, if you are." He stared at her, and she could see the war playing out across his expressive face again. Desire so powerful, it was almost tangible, warring with disbelief that she could actually want this, want him. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice rough. "Because once this happens, there's no going back, and I won't have you regretting it, resenting me for." "I won't," Rosalind said with more confidence than she felt. "I've been watching you, Maximilian, learning you. You're not what I expected, not what anyone told me to expect. And I think," she managed a small smile, "I think I'd like to know all of you, not just the parts you show at dinner." He rose from his chair slowly, his movements even more careful than usual, as though he were approaching something wild and easily startled. When he reached her, he actually knelt, lowering that massive frame until they were eye level and took her hands in his. "I need you to understand," he said quietly, intensely, "that I've never, with my size, the mechanics are." He trailed off, frustration and embarrassment warring in his expression. Rosalind understood what he was trying not to say, that his size made everything more complicated, that he was afraid of hurting her, that despite his years, he was almost as inexperienced as she was, because what woman would willingly take a man of his proportions to bed? "Then we'll figure it out together," she said simply. "And Maximilian, I trust you. You've been nothing but gentle with me since I arrived. I know you'll be careful." Something that might have been awe crossed his face. "You trust me," he repeated, as though the concept were foreign. "I do," she confirmed, and realized, with some surprise, that it was true. What followed was tender and awkward, and sometimes painful and somehow perfect in its imperfection. Maximilian was indeed careful, almost too careful, constantly stopping to ask if she was all right, if she needed him to stop, if she was certain. His gentleness, combined with his obvious desire and his equally obvious fear of hurting her, made Rosalind's heart ache in ways she hadn't anticipated. Afterward, as they lay together in her bed, his presence, making even the large four-poster seem small, Rosalind traced patterns on his broad chest and wondered at how completely her life had changed in less than a month. "Thank you," Maximilian said quietly, into the darkness. "For what? For this? For trusting me? For not being disgusted by?" He gestured vaguely at himself. Rosalind pushed herself up on one elbow to look down at him. "I'm not disgusted. How could I be disgusted by someone who's shown me nothing but kindness and patience?" And she hesitated, then pushed forward, and something that might eventually become love. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheek with exquisite tenderness. Eventually, I need time, she admitted. This has all happened so fast, and I'm still trying to sort through everything I feel. But Maximilian, she leaned down to press her forehead against his. What I'm feeling isn't disgust or resentment or fear. It's something else, something I want to explore, if you'll let me. If I'll let you? He laughed softly, the sound rumbling through his chest beneath her hand. Rosalind, I've been yours since I saw you in that gallery 7 years ago. I'm just grateful you might, someday, consider being mine. I already am, she said. I married you, didn't I? You were sold to me, he corrected gently. There's a difference. Perhaps, Rosalind allowed, but I'm choosing to stay, to be here with you, to build something real from this strange beginning. That has to count for something. He pulled her down against his chest, his massive arms enfolding her with a gentleness that contradicted everything society thought they knew about him. It counts for everything, he whispered into her hair. Everything. And as Rosalind drifted toward sleep, safe and warm in the arms of the monster who'd married her, she thought about the girl she'd been in that gallery 7 years ago, the one who'd looked at a ballroom and seen magic. That girl had believed in fairy tales and happy endings, and the possibility that the world contained something beautiful and good. She'd lost that belief somewhere along the way, worn down by 3 seasons of being invisible, by the slow realization that fairy tales didn't happen to girls like her. But perhaps, just perhaps, she'd been wrong. Because here she was, in the arms of a man who'd spent 7 years remembering her wonder, who'd arranged his entire world to keep her safe, who'd married her not despite who she was, but because of it. Perhaps monsters and overlooked girls could find their happy endings after all. They just looked different than anyone expected.